primary advisor for the International Studies undergraduate major, which has over 200 students. And really the emphasis of the lecture series is to reach out not only, of course, our own students, but primarily the undergraduate population at the upper levels, as well as the rest of the university and the general public. And also I want to introduce Ken Carpenter, who is part of the ISI team teaching the capstone seminar. Julie Williams, our wonderful graduate assistant and instructor of English herself. And thank you all for coming. Before I introduce today's speaker, I would like to thank our colleagues and entities within and beyond the university for making this happen, not just in terms of helping us financially, but also with regards to content, ideas, and all-around support. And those include the New Mexico Humanities Council and the National Endowment for the Humanities. That's extramurally, as well as the Colorado European Union Center of Excellence and the European Union. And Adelamar, who is sitting here, was actually instrumental in helping us get those grants. Within the university, the Office of the Provost, the College of Arts and Sciences, the Feminist Research Institute, University College, Peace Studies Program, and the History Department are all appreciated for supporting the lecture series and our efforts. Today's speaker, it is my pleasure, my honor to introduce Dely Alcantara, a friend and colleague who is the director of the UNM Geospatial and Population Studies program and research professor both from the Latin American Iberian Institute and the School of Architecture and Planning. She's currently working on the status of women and domestic violence. Her research focusing on the relationship between women's education, income achievement, and domestic violence, and how this varies across levels of development. And I want to underscore that part of our lecture series title is Global Challenges and Solutions. And so I think part of what Dely and other colleagues have been studying are also these bright moments that make us hopeful for the future. Dely, thank you.
Thank you, Lainey. Actually, I came belatedly to doing domestic violence and status of women, although in my previous life, my dissertation was on the status of married women in the Philippines. And from that dissertation, I concluded that the Filipino women were quite powerful, and that the feminist position of, moving towards equality was really lessening the power of the Filipino woman, because they already have a lot of power, so moving towards equality is reducing their power and ceding more power to their husbands. Now, what's interesting in what I found in that dissertation was that when the women had more education, more income than their husbands, they're more likely to lose power, because they have to do this balancing act between saving the husband's ego and maintaining the marriage. So there is this game, I call it a game, and I sort of saw this even when I was little, where the women, well, let me backtrack here. The Philippines was colonized by Spain for over 300 years. After Spain came the US, but the indigenous culture of the Philippines is matriarchal. So with the overlay of patriarchy, the more you have contact with the colonizers, either through education or through living in the urban area or through religion, the less power the women had. So, so there is this front stage, backstage kind of relationship between power and what is public and what is private. But I'm just introducing my presentation this way because that's the experience that I have in the Philippines. And in fact, when I came in this country, or let me say, when I was growing up, I only knew of one woman, and that was my cousin, who had ever experienced domestic violence. And the reason being, at least in my mind at the time, was because her husband was always drunk. So My parents we never saw any fighting between my parents. I guess they did it when all the children were out of the house. So I grew up with this idealistic memory of growing up with little violence. And if there wasn't all violence, they were our neighbors fighting each other, but these are men, and they take it to the street because the main road in front of our house, there were not that many cars. So they needed an audience, so they would go there and brandish their bolos and started screaming at each other, and then everybody in the neighborhood would go out and watch and see if they're ever really gonna hit each other. But, we never saw any blood or anything of that sort. I come to this country and 2006, some Asian women approached me and said, Dely, we need to look at the issue of domestic violence among immigrant Asian women. And I knew, from reading the literature and from other people's research when I was a grad student, that there's a lot of dislocation among the immigrant population, particularly when they come to this country, and the men generally have difficulty adjusting to the U.S. culture. They have a harder time learning the English language. The women are faster in assimilating into the U.S. culture. So as a result, the women get jobs, and the men who used to be the breadwinners in their country no longer have that role. So as a result of that, there's a lot of conflict. So like I said, when I was approached in 2006 to write a proposal to the Crime Victim Reparation Commission for the state, I asked a lot of questions, and I said, is it prevalent among the Asians? And of course, the answer was, we don't know. So reluctantly, I wrote a proposal, and as a result of that, I created the Asian Family Center of New Mexico, or the New Mexico Asian Family Center. And when the community found out about the focus of the center, one of the men in one of the major Asian communities said, you are interfering with our ability to control our women. So I looked and I said, oh, okay. And then another group said, we are very highly educated, we're very rich, we have no domestic violence. So that was my first exposure to the Asian community. Nevertheless, we launched this project. And now, 8 years later, people are coming and referring their friends, referring their parents, and so we now have a program that I would say now is trusted, and so people are self-recruiting or recruiting other people. And I guess to my surprise, and maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, that women commit violence against their partners as well, and although to a lesser degree. And this presentation today, is my own educating myself as to how prevalent really is this domestic violence or intimate partner violence, around the world or countries in the world. And it just so happened that the USAID has been doing surveys, what they call the demographic and health surveys. I don't know if you've heard about this. They do this in not in developed countries, but mostly in industrializing countries and in countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America. So, and they started this in the late 80s. And countries are encouraged to participate. It's a national survey. And in the beginning, it started mostly as a demographic survey. So they wanted to know, fertility, practice of contraception, immortality, and primarily to see, how they can help with programs that can alleviate poverty, improve infant mortality, maternal and child health. Now, more recently, I discovered that they're asking very specific questions about violence, and particularly intimate partner violence. And so I thought, so when Elaine asked me, I was just starting to look at these surveys, and lesson learned, do not agree until you've seen all the data to do the presentation. Because I thought, like you have these modules that are standardized. It turns out some countries will opt to use some of the modules and not all of the modules. So then for comparability, you can't have all of the countries that you choose because not all of them will implement all the modules that are suggested. Also, as I look at the data, I know that in the past, every 5 years they repeat the survey. But it turns out some countries are now refusing to also implement the survey. So not all, so in the end, I chose 20 countries that are closest in years for the survey, so that at least there's not too much of a disparity with respect to the timing of the incidents. And it will still allow me to do some comparisons. So I have a confession to make. I just finished the last slide before I came here, so I don't have slides and conclusions, but you can help me get there, because there are some surprising findings, which are even very surprising to me. And I gave this picture to Elaine. We just came back we went to Africa, and this is a scene in Tanzania, where the women are waiting for the fishermen to come ashore. And it is really kind of interesting, because before we got here, we were in a Maasai village where we found out that the women did everything. The men did the herding, the women built the homes. They don't garden, because the Maasais are herders. So they take care of the children and do everything else. And the men, so I was quite surprised when we went to another village that the women, of course, it shouldn't be surprising, the country is diverse, that the women do a lot of the business. And so this is a scene in the afternoon where they're waiting for the fishermen to come ashore. And I thought it was nice and colorful, and gave me an idea of the diversity in any one country, how diverse the economy is, how diverse the people are, how diverse the culture is. So generalizing from one to the other makes that, makes you be very cautious. So how this presentation came about is really out of my curiosity. Now, how prevalent is domestic violence around the world? And what is the correlation between the status of women and domestic violence? Does education matter? Does participation in the labor force matter? And does women empowerment matter? When I talk about women empowerment, it's their participation in major decision-making in their household. It's not, in a lot of countries, being empowered is really not running for political office, but taking control of your personal life. So, like I said, coming from a childhood that you saw very little violence, and the only violence I saw was my cousin, and I thought that, because she was not very well educated, that she just took it, or that the husband took advantage of that. So anyhow, so these are the things that sort of, out of curiosity, what is going on in the world? Because we hear in the US media, how high the violence that is perpetrated against women. So, as I told you, the major source of the data or the information that I'm going to be presenting today are from the demographic and health surveys, and the United Nations, the World Bank, and the Population Reference Bureau. I use those as sources for looking at the population, the GDP, or the gross national index, and also the number of women aged 15 to 49. What are the countries in this study? Where are the countries? So there's no systematic selection. I just look at what is available, what countries are available between 2011 and 2013. So there are countries in the Caribbean, Central America, South America, East Africa, Middle Africa, West Africa, South Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and West Asia. And most of the recent surveys had been conducted in Africa. There's very few in South America that are current, or in Central America. So just to give you an idea how scattered the survey is, here is the map of the world, and so this is Africa. The countries are not identified, but East Africa, West Africa, Middle Africa, although Comoros are these set of islands here. And then I didn't realize that, like Asia, because before they used to refer to the Philippines as the Far East. Japan is the Far East, but we're now part of Southeast Asia. So there's nothing in here, no surveys in North America other than in the Caribbean. Now, what are the characteristics of the country in terms of their, their place in terms of economic development? And I just looked at the gross national income per capita, and you could see that the highest is actually Peru. And that came as a surprise to me. I thought it would be Nigeria because of the oil. And the lowest is in Liberia, and that's where we have in Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And this is a challenge too. The Democratic Republic of Congo, where else? Benin. The reports are in French. So I have to if the tables were standardized, I could pretty much guess what the title is, but then they're not. So I have to go Google search, Google Translate to make sure that I'm looking at the right table, so that I could get the right statistics. Life expectancy at birth ranges from, is it 52 is the lowest one, to 75, which is also Peru. And these are the population in thousands, so you multiply this by 1,000, you get the population in the millions. And women who are aged 15 to 49, the reason I have to put this here is that when you look at my presentation, they're mostly percentages. So for purposes of comparison across countries and across time, percentages or proportions are the tools to use. But that really can be very misleading because the population could be very large and the percentage is very small, but the affected population, when you multiply that prevalence rate against the population of women, that number can be large. So this is where those who are graduate students, when do you use a percent and when do you use the absolute number? And so that's why I had to, go and find out. And the other statistics that I wanted to also use in the calculation was ever married women. I didn't know that was such a mysterious number. I couldn't find anywhere. They have percent of contraceptive use, fertility rates, but they won't give me the denominator of ever married women. So that was really kind of interesting. Now, so the first slide was to give you a general picture of the countries. Now the second slide is who are the women that they interviewed, the characteristics of the women that they interviewed. And if you look at the first column here, women under age 30, that most of the countries are predominantly, the respondents were predominantly young. The ones that responded to the surveys were predominantly young. And then employment. employment here is percent employed in the last 12 years, whether they were currently working 7 days ago or in the, not 12 years, in the last 12 months. So you could see it ranges from a low of 15% in Bangladesh to a high of 77% employment. And what is really kind of interesting is how they parse the word employment, and when it comes to in what form they were paid. And here I just took out the ones that were paid in cash, because in the report they also say paid in cash and in kind. So I don't know what in kind, is it barter? It's not quite defined. So what I ended up doing is just getting how many percent of these women aged 15 to 49 were paid in cash for their work. And you can see that it can be as high as 92 in Bangladesh, but look at the women, the percent of women employed in Bangladesh, it's only 15%, but of those who work, they were paid in cash. And I was actually, I had high hopes for my own country. And I was shocked. Only 57% said they were employed in the last 12 months. I said, oh, but I know that they work, but I guess employment is probably like more in the formal sector rather than the informal sector.
I was just going to ask whether that's formal employment or does it include self-employment? So if somebody has a food stand by the side of the road, would they consider themselves employed under the survey?
In the survey it was defined that way, but some people may not define themselves as working or employed because they were not employed by someone else. So it could also be like in the translation something gets lost. Because like I said, I was surprised for the Philippines because I thought that would have been much higher simply because, a lot of people own small businesses. Or women own small businesses. Most of the small businesses, like 90% of the small businesses in the Philippines are run by women. They're owned by women. So, like I said, how was that translated? Does it include those informal sector employment or not? And then women with secondary or higher education, so it ranges from 8 in Benin, to a high of 83, which is the Philippines. Those of you who are doing cross-country comparison, even a simple statistics like education is very tricky, it turns out, because different countries have different systems of education. So, at the end, I just decided, okay, if they say secondary, or there's even a secondary first and second, and then secondary, third and fourth cycle, I don't exactly know what those means, and I go and Google, and sometimes I say, like in Comoros, I said, is it under the English system, or is it in the French system? So it's kind of difficult even for those very simple statistics. And I threw in men with secondary education or higher, and if there's an asterisk, there's no data. Like they didn't collect the data for the men. How many percent live in urban areas? Just to show you, where most of the people live. And again, the least urban of the residents or the respondents are in Nepal. And I'm not surprised by that at all. And the most urban is Peru. I thought it was Jordan, actually. Did I mess this up? Oh, yeah, it's Jordan. It's 83% of the women or the respondents live in urban area. Now, there was no income in the data, but they classified their wealth in terms of quintiles. So I just took here, for purposes of statistics, I took the percent of those women in the lowest quintile, which is like the poorest of the population. And Timor-Leste, this is I think a very young country. It's separated from Indonesia, has the highest proportion of people in the lowest quintile. And I look at what is their exposure to mass media? Who are they modeling themselves after? And I chose television rather than internet because not everybody has access to internet, and television is the most modern mass media, in most of the countries. So, oops. So this is just a graph, and you could see Cameroon has the youngest respondents, and Jordan have the oldest respondents, because this is percent under age 30. With high school or education, the Philippines had the highest, and Benin had the lowest in terms of the proportion of women with high school and higher education. So the question is, does this translate to less domestic violence or becoming a victim of less of violence? Come on. That's just the men. In Congo Democratic Republic, the Philippines did not ask the men for their education. So I was really quite surprised by that. I guess they didn't think that it was important for them. And this is the statistics just in graphics. Again, so there's Jordan, and Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, has the lowest exposure to television. And here's just to show you the percent of women who are employed in the last 12 months, and Cambodia has the highest, and Bangladesh has the lowest. Paid in cash, we know that, but fewer women in Bangladesh get paid. Now, women's participation in deciding how the wife's earnings are used. And you could see that in Armenia, most of them, I guess with very few exceptions, what's the lowest number is 74, and that's in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The women actively participate in deciding how their earnings are used, and even how their husband's earnings are used. Benin has the lowest, then you have Cameroon, so most of the lowest participation in how they decide the husband's earnings are in Africa. Now, major household purchases like television and maybe cars in some places, the women also participate. Now, visits to relatives, I didn't even really know why that was there, but I guess in a lot of countries, it could be enough reason. And in fact, some women said that they really have to ask permission, to even go visit their friends. So I guess that's why they included that, because it's also a form of control, of the women. So in all of those that were considered as major aspects of the women's lives, they have high participation. So when I saw these numbers, and as we go into the violence section, it's interesting to me how now, are these really the correct measures of empowerment? Because, there's variation, but it is very high, and so we may have to, and like I said, I do this, I give you the numbers, and then I show, in rank order, these are percent who make decisions in participating, just to show you, which of the countries have the highest participation of women. And when I say participation, mostly the women doing the deciding or jointly with their husband. So they have a say-so. And in their own health, it is mostly the women jointly with their husbands. And as you get into Africa, here, Comoros, Congo, Nigeria, Cameroon, the women, it's mostly the husband primarily deciding on the woman's own health. So there's something, and when they say own health, is it, primarily when they get sick, or is it that also include their children? I am not sure. So now it comes to purchases. Again, the countries with the exception of Pakistan. You know, most of the countries, in most of the countries, the women have a major say-so. Deciding to visit friends, it's the same pattern. I took this picture of a zebra intimidating a hyena. And when the hyena left, the zebra turned to us and started nodding its head, trying to get us away. So I thought, you know, so I've never seen other animals, you know, doing this to another species, but I thought that was kind of interesting. Now, what surprised me is when they asked the women if wife beating is justified and for whatever reason. This is, to me, the most shocking, actually, that women expect, this is the proportion of women who believe that wife beating is justified for any reason, like burning the food, neglecting the children, refusing to have sex, and there's one more I'm forgetting right now. And the husband's response, with the exception of Timor-Leste, you know, is usually lower than the woman's response in terms of justified beating, wife beating. So I thought that was really kind of interesting. You know, what makes you think that your husband is justified to beat you for burning the food? You know, but in any case, except in this one particular case, this one I neglected, that's not in the same scale, but nevertheless, you know, that's only the country where, you know, the husband was more, the proportion of husbands feeling justified to beat the wife for any of the 4 reasons that was enumerated was higher. And just so, you know, with at least one reason mentioned, here, Armenia, you know, where, if it is positive, I think what I did was the wife's response minus the husband's response. So if it's positive, the women had a higher expectation or higher proportion of women who feels that wife beating is justified. Okay, so Armenia, in this country, and I guess it was a mistake that the scale was not correct in the last one. Armenia is the singular country, you know, that deviates from this pattern of higher expectation among women. And this is just another one of those doors that we took a picture of. And there's an interesting story, because when we were in Tanzania, particularly in Zanzibar, I saw these women with full burqa, but they had tight-fitting clothes. I said, that's really interesting. Is that a rebellion against the burqa, but, you know, conform and then use the tight-fitting clothes rather than the loose burqa? And I just put that there as maybe just a symbol of, you know, underground. That's my own interpretation. Here are the reasons. She burns the food. She argues with him. She neglects the children. She goes out without telling him. And you could see the women expect or feels that their husband is justified in beating them if they went out without telling him. You know, and then she refuses to have sex. It's even less important, I guess, when you look at it, than this one. Because there's more of the women expecting, you know, or at least feel that the husband is justified in beating the wife. But most of the responses were if she neglects the children. You know, those are the highest proportion of women that said they expect the husband to beat them. Now, rural, urban, again, all of these, I'm just showing you like patterns, that there is a high level of expectation in most of the countries. You know, so like this is the norm. You know, is this something that has been there for generations, that they witness their mothers being beaten by their husbands, so they expect that to happen to them as well. And singularly here, for no education versus higher education, this is no education minus high school education. Isn't that surprising, though? That those with no education, well, it's not surprising, I guess. Those with no education, of course, expected more. More of them expected their husbands to beat them up. And then again, the lowest versus the highest quintile. So there is something to be said about getting more education and having more money. And I don't know how they measured the wealth quintile. I have to look at what gets into the wealth. So there are 3 countries where women with no education had less proportion of women expecting that, or saying that wife beating is justified, and that's Indonesia, Nigeria, and Armenia. Now, the percent of women who have experienced violence from their husband or partner, ever experience in their lifetime since they were 15 years old up to the time they were 49, because the respondents are from 15 to 49. These are the percentage of women who have ever experienced physical, sexual, or emotional. So one mention of physical, sexual, or emotional. These are not additive. If physical is mentioned, sexual is mentioned, or emotional is mentioned, this is the proportion of women that have ever experienced violence of any form. And the lowest is the Philippines, and the highest is Congo Democratic Republic. And when you look at each of these individual ones, it is quite high. Like I said, although this is interesting because it's supposed to be anyway. So violence in the last 12 months. So this is more current. It's lower, but still, it's quite high. In the Congo Democratic Republic, when 30% of the 15 to 49 said that they have experienced physical violence in the last 12 months, sexual violence is about 20% and 13% emotional, and in some of the reports they call it psychological. And I just use the one that's most common. And then, during their last pregnancy, they were also asked if they experienced violence. And so this is the distribution of the women who have experienced violence while they were pregnant in their, the last pregnancy that they had. So, I was, although, let me go back. I guess although the Philippines is quite low, the number of women in that 15 to 49 is quite high. I was really, I guess there's a lot of those things that are really hidden. Because in the Philippines, a pregnant woman has a lot of privileges. That's when you can command anybody to do your bidding. Because being pregnant or the child is precious and they don't want you to miscarry. And so they kind of take care of you, and that's when the women really, will demand from their husband, I want that coconut, you go climb the tree, and the husband complies. But I guess it also changes when you have too many children already. It's not too novel to have a child. But in any case, in Pakistan, although it's a far second from Congo Democratic Republic, it's 11% of women who were pregnant experience violence. Now, if the women participated in none of the decisions, any of the 4 decisions that we saw earlier, here are the proportion of women that experience violence. And then if they participated in 1 to 2 decisions, here is the number. And for some of the countries, it's really kind of interesting that I'm looking at Pakistan here, there's Nepal, Mali. It doesn't matter how many decisions you participate in. it doesn't seem to really matter. Um, and here, Pakistan, even if you look at this one, if you participate in one or two decisions, you're almost twice more likely to have had experienced violence. So there could also be like I said, the quality of the decisions, and so now even after I've written my dissertation and participation in different aspects of decision making in the household, I'm beginning to really question, the measurements of empowerment that we're looking at, on a cross-comparative perspective. So here, if we look at if the wife is better educated, it does not seem to be different than when the husband is better educated, right? So this is you would think that the wife with the better education would be a little bit more immune from that, but it doesn't seem to follow. Then they're both equally educated. The incidence or the prevalence is still really quite high, and neither of them is educated. When you look at both equally educated and you compare them with this, particularly in the Congo Democratic Republic, when neither is educated, they have a lower prevalence than both are educated, or when the wife has an advantage, or when the husband is better educated. So now, in some countries, age has its advantage. Asia, they respect age. So, you would think that if the woman is older than the husband, that she will have a little bit more control. But then again, if the wife is older, and if you compare it across the different categories of whether the wife is younger or whether they are the same age, look at this, the variations are not that great. So, and this is whether you're in the lowest quintile or where you are in the highest quintile, where it makes difference if you are in the highest quintile. Here are the countries where the richer they are, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 countries, the less, but it's still about 20%. And here in these countries, it doesn't make a difference. Wealth doesn't make a difference. Now, consumption of alcohol, this is really the biggest cause of violence. It's like the more the husband consumes alcohol, the higher the prevalence of domestic violence or, against women, against the partner, the female partner. This is kind of, interesting because these countries, and if, although I started with 20, those other countries did not ask alcohol consumption. They asked tobacco smoking instead. So I guess it becomes more of a health issue, although domestic violence or violence could also be a health issue, but they substituted tobacco smoking for husband's consumption of alcohol. Now, the more the husband controls, so forms of control, like you can't go and visit your friends, the husband is jealous, and all of that. The more the husband controls, have more controlling behavior, the higher the domestic violence, and that's something that we expect. Now, it's also interesting, in some of the countries, they also ask the women if they had ever committed violence against their husbands. And some of them have responded or used that, and it's much lower degree, and the Philippines has the highest in terms of ever committed violence against their husband or their partner. and physical violence, they have ever committed violence, physical violence against their partner or spouse, and in the past 12 months. So, I got to go back and look at what's going on around my own, my own country, because this is really kind of shocking to me.
But isn't that the wife's experience of
against their husband?
But it sounds like she's the one who experienced it.
Oh, I guess maybe this one might be mislabeled.
Yeah, the first two are violence against the husband. And
yeah, so both of these. Both of
woman.
these. So I should have said violence of, because I copied, I duplicated the slide and forgot to change the title. But this is the woman ever committing violence against the partner. So, yeah. So thank you for catching that. So they do. So here, much lower. Again, the Philippines has the highest, regardless of whether the wife is older, the wife is younger, they have the highest incidence of women committing violence against their partner. And alcohol consumption, it's also high among the women. I mean, women committing violence is also high when their husband gets drunk very often. Now, they said they're afraid of their husband most of the time, but they still beat them up. Sometimes, and if they're never afraid. So like I said, it's probably like, when it becomes like a fight. Not a one-sided thing, but, they may be afraid, but they have to defend themselves, so they end up having to fight with their spouse or their partner. And the Philippines is very high, So now here's what I was talking about in the beginning. The percentages in some countries may be small, but when you start looking at it in terms of how many women are affected by this violence and this multiplying the population by these rates, this is the number of women affected totally. In these countries where they reported violence, there's 48 million women that have ever been affected or ever experienced violence. And when you look at it on a daily basis, 132,000 women, have ever experienced violence. So, and this is just a few of the countries. And so, it's really, I think that's why there's a lot of focus now in these most recent surveys, because it's beginning to be a health issue. When they get injured, especially with the physical violence, and women do not necessarily go and seek help, because I guess to them it's also like a private matter. Now when you're pregnant, that's even worse, because then there's two people that are receiving the violence. So the last 12 months, it's lower. It's almost half than those who have experienced, but still 20 million women have experienced this is more physical violence in the last 12 months preceding the survey. So it's a large number no matter how you look at it. Now, I guess, my takeaway from all of these data that I looked at is that, like I said, I'm now beginning to really question the measures of empowerment with respect to participation in major decision making. Or is it the case that, and I don't know, I'm just kind of speculating at this point, like, is it when the women are I guess powerful because they participate in a lot of these decisions, that the physical violence is like a comeback or a retaliation for the fact that the husband feel that they are emasculated because the women are participating in greater degree with decisions. I don't know, but I think even for me that I thought participating in those major decisions would at least, make you to be more assertive and be able to, I guess, avert especially physical violence, because emotional violence, even I sometimes, if I don't correct myself, I can inflict pain by just words, and that's something really difficult to, you have to be constantly be aware of what you say. But physical violence is the one that's really most prevalent. So I don't know. I came away with two shocking findings. The expectation of, or the justification for wife beating is very high, no matter what the education is. And in most of the countries that I have looked at, and that, to a large degree, being better educated than your husband, is not to your advantage. And so, those were the two most shocking findings to me, and this is just scratching the surface of these data sets. I have not even done, because I have to look at, can I even put these countries together, or do you have to run different models, for each of the country, or can I, I'm looking at the sampling and it looks like I may be able to do that, but it's not really quite clear that, to look at, like a regression model to see which of these really correlates with domestic violence. I haven't even looked at that. These are just all descriptive statistics that I was able to key in. Lesson that I learned too is it turns out that a PDF can be turned into a Word document that you could cut and paste. With the most recent PDF, I have to enter all 20 countries until my programmer saw me doing this. What are you doing, Dely? He said, I'm entering these numbers. I said, why didn't you ask me? And I said, well, I looked at my PDF and it said it's not capable of doing that. So for those of you who don't know, like me, get the most recent PDF version, and you will be able to convert a PDF into Excel or Word. And then you could just cut and paste and create those tables. So anyhow, so I learned quite a bit, preparing for this presentation, and also preparing me for doing further research into the status of women and domestic violence. Thank you.
So Eleni asked me to serve as the commentator, and I think I took that as the person maybe asked the first couple of questions. Thank you for alerting us to this wealth of data that's out there and allows us to do international comparisons. I think it's very interesting to anybody who does social science type work. I think you, in your concluding remarks, you already pointed out what we learned from the graphical and numerical evidence that you showed us, is that there are very complex interrelationships between all of these variables. And one thing that I was thinking about, looking particularly at the subset of countries that you looked at, where there may be some of the variables that may play a role, are the percentage of population that lives in rural versus urban areas. Does religious background matter, in the sense that it might have very strong prescriptions of what the woman's role is to be, and maybe what the allowable quote-unquote violence is from male partners to female, from husbands to wives, and perhaps even, but that may not be in the data, the prevalence to which some of these marriages might have been arranged rather than marriages that, like in our society, typically are, because we select our own partners. The other question that I had when you were mentioning the fact that women often consider domestic violence sort of as a blemish and a private matter, and they don't seek help, might also refer back to the kind of legal system that is in the country where they preside, whether domestic violence is even a felony, and whether there would be legal redress, leaving aside self-help centers like the shelters that we have in this country and so forth. So those are some of the questions that I had when I was listening to your presentation.
Yes, thank you, Christine. Those questions occurred to me as well. However, because of the roughness of what I presented, at the back of my mind, I said, how much of this is really cultural? How much of this is religious? Although in some countries they asked the religion, in the tables they didn't cross-tabulate religion with the incidence of domestic violence. And that's something for further study, because I was curious about that as well. Because in the Catholic religion, being raised Catholic all my life, it's like, if you're the wife, it's your duty to obey your husband and to do his bidding, so those are the next steps, and I will have to look further into, like I said, into the way that they did the sample to see if I can merge these countries or not, because all these cultural factors, these religious factors, and whether you're rural or urban, what are the marital practices, the marriage practices, all of those questions cannot be answered by the way that they presented the data. So it really needs to be modeled and looked at more, and we could download the individual data actually, which is quite interesting. But for all the brains that went into designing the surveys and the sampling, it is mind-boggling, how they created samples of subsamples, so that it's very difficult to tease out which weight you're going to use. So to the untrained mind, there's several different weights. So which weight am I going to use? So so in order to ask the kinds of questions that you're raising, I think we really have to go back to the individual data and run those models to see and variables that they have avoided in presenting for the country reports need to be looked at very carefully. I think this is part of the downside of cross-country research, and also tiptoeing around the political correctness of how data can be presented and analyzed. Because I think some of the countries, I think, they're afraid that some of these countries may not want to participate if they dig deeper into these kinds of relationships. Because like I said, the issue of domestic violence was not asked until starting around 2009. So it wasn't part of the original design for the demographic and health surveys. But I think the United Nations, what was it, the Beijing conference, that was 1975, when they started raising this. Can you imagine this issue has been raised in 1975. We're now 2014, and we're still squeamish about the way that we handle this and how we raise the questions and how we analyze the data. And this is, I think, as social scientists, once we also go into this normative science, we're afraid to deviate from that normative thinking. And there's a lot of things, and I'm, although, like I said, don't agree to do something the day before you're leaving, or if you haven't looked at the data yet. I learned a lot myself, because I've been designing surveys, since I was a graduate student. And these cross-cultural surveys have taught me a lot in terms of what are the limitations, particularly when you're looking at cross-country. Because when you look at the reports themselves, there's very few mention of norms, like cultural norms, or even the effect of religion. Only that there's so many percent Catholic, so many percent Islamic, so many percent Buddhist. So they are just in the descriptive characteristics of the respondents themselves, but never correlated in a way that is meaningful. And the other thing also for me is, this raised a lot more questions than it answered. So now I'm more intrigued, and especially after we came back from Africa, like I'm now looking at what really does it mean, like in Tanzania or among the Maasai women, to do all the work, the household work, taking of the children, and the husband is the herder, and that's all they do. How does that translate to their kind of relationships? And I'm not an anthropologist. I am actually very squeamish in doing participant observation. I know Beverly is an anthropologist and takes films and all that. We'll have a different perspective. But, I'd like to have someone with that kind of training to look into the dynamics of the family. Because I'm really afraid. While I do surveys, I design the survey, I will train the interviewer, but I'm very squeamish about going to people and going up to them and talking. So I just really watch. But there's only so much you can do by doing that. It's really being involved in getting there and watching them on a more long-term basis that I think we begin to understand what all of these different pieces, how they relate and how culture, social change takes a long time. To occur. But this is, like I said, I think the reason that surveys are now beginning and funders are now really interested in looking at this more broadly is that it is now in the context of a public health issue, in a maternal and child health issue. And it is. But how do we instigate the change? How do we facilitate the change so that these is really minimized? Because it's really an eye-opener for me, and it's even a bigger eye-opener that the Filipino women are the most violent. I mean, at least according to this survey, they have the highest percentage of committing violence against their spouse, So this is really kind of interesting. I could see myself doing that, but I have a very gentle husband, so it would really be insane if I beat him up. But I can see myself, So there's this level of awareness, I think, that we all have to also. But how do you I guess educate is the word that comes to mind, but how do you raise the level of awareness of these people if the educational system does not seem to alleviate it? I think that's the question. So it also behooves us to start looking at what are we learning? What is being transferred to us through the educational system? I can tell you that coming from the Philippines, where the educational system is primarily American and Western, when I came to this country, I didn't realize how, I hate to use the word cliche, how colonized I was until I started doing my dissertation, and my data of 10,000 household surveys is giving me the wrong direction in terms of what are the indicators of status of women or, among married women in the Philippines, when children becomes the sole significant indicator of women's empowerment. And if you have a higher income or if you have higher education, they're all in the negative direction. If I didn't have 10,000 cases, I would have said, gather more data. But it was then at that moment when I said, what is my culture all about? That I started asking the questions. Why is the direction in the wrong, why are my variables showing me the wrong direction? And this again is also like an eye-opener, and I'm just scratching the surface. But I'm just looking at cross tabs, so I'm looking, there's very few young faces here, and if you're graduate students, and you look at data, I think, it is good practice to question, what is being presented, and not just take it as though because it's printed or collected by experts, that is what, it is what it is. That there's a lot of questioning that needs to occur. When you use somebody else's data or even your own data as you collect them. So, yes, Ken.
Two of the countries that kind of jumped out at me from your list were the Congo,
Yeah.
which has had a really brutal civil war with 4 or 5 million people killed. And then the other one was Honduras, which of course has the highest murder rate, has a very high rate of violent crime. So I wonder, to add to Christine's list, you might look at the status of war or the status of criminal violence outside of the family.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. You know, so we could bring data external to the surveys and use them for the analyses. Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I'm just starting to look at that. Like, why are these numbers the way they are? You know, some you expect, but others you don't expect. So I tell my students, I said, because I'm in demography, both a sociologist and a demographer, why I like being a demographer, because the numbers lead you to other questions. You know, you ask yourself, why are these numbers the way they are? You know, so they're not really that sterile. People think that the numbers are numbers and they're objective. Numbers occur in a context. And that's exactly, you know, what you're proposing to do. And I think, you know, if as I delve more into this topic and look at all those different countries, also the historical background of these countries, you know, would be very important. Because as of now, they're just like, here they are, you know. So.
In a previous discussion a few years ago, you had mentioned how in the Philippines they did not persecute the Marcoses, that the direction was to move forward and reconcile in a way. So that is also, and to me that was an eye-opener, because in the Middle East I'm always thinking there has to be the long memory of conflict and so on, and that breeds more conflict.
Yeah.
So that is also an interesting contrast to what happens inside the house, assuming that that information is correct, and maybe it's...
Yeah, no, at least I can speak about the Philippines, and as you pointed out, you know, the Filipinos, once the Marcoses were down, there was no interest in prosecuting them anymore other than return the money. Because I guess the thinking is, there is no point. You know, we've already made our point. They're corrupt and they're dictators and they're gone. Now, you know, inside the household, I don't know how that translates. You know, maybe I should go back to my cousin and ask her, because she remained married to him. You know, and I was like about 10. She would come to our house, and as a 10-year-old, I said, why do you have to stay with him? You know, you can come stay with us. But then 2 months later, 3 months later, he's back with him. Of course, now that I have this Asian Family Center, my case managers tell me it's on average 17 times, you know, of being battered before a woman, or this is on average, before the woman would eventually leave, and even that with a lot of trepidation. So it's really, you know, I guess a very difficult decision. And like Christine was saying, maybe religion also has a hold on it. Because like I know when I was already in grad school, that I was working as a research assistant at the Population Institute in the Philippines, our administrative officer, you know, she was in her 50s, would say, you know, when you get married and if your husband wants sex, you got to give it to him. And so all of these, you know, 20-year-old looking at her and said, if you don't want to, what are you going to do? What is he going to do? And he said, well, it's part of your duty as a Catholic wife. So, you know, we were like saying, because we were all Catholic, so he said, then maybe we should stop being Catholic. But then the men you're going to marry are mostly Catholic. You know, you don't really have a choice, you know. But that was, and so this our administrative officer, now in retrospect, was also priming us in terms of what we expect within that marriage. And I don't know whether, but you know, like in the Philippines, what is called a celibacy rate, is about 25% in urban areas. 25% of all women of married, 15 years and older, do not get married. And it goes higher. The more highly educated the woman, the less they're inclined to get married. And I have asked my friends this, and they said, if I want children, my brothers and sisters have too many children. If I want money, I make my own money. What do I want? What do I need from a man? Like a brick to hit my head with? So of the 5 best friends, I'm the only one married. All 4 are not married, and they all work at the university. And they said, I make more than enough money. I don't need support. But so there's a, being Catholic. But I also saw that in the French-speaking countries, never married women are called something. That translates to me as celibate, in the category of marriage. It's something that translates to celibate to me. And in the Philippines, it's the same way. Like you don't have premarital sex, so it's called the celibacy rate. So more educated women in the Philippines, over 20% don't get married. So was this what you expected, Delaney?
Thank you, and more. Thank you.